So we're discussing Belarusian I by Valzhyna Mort. Now, this is a really interesting poem and with very fascinating imagery. So let's just deep dive into the text itself. Belarusian I. Even our mothers have no idea how we were born, how we parted their legs and crawled out into the world, the way you crawl from the ruins after a bombing. We couldn't tell which of us was a girl or a boy. We gorged on dirt thinking it was bread. And our future, a gymnast on a thin thread of the horizon, was performing there at the highest pitch. We grew up in a country where first your door is stroked with chalk, then a chariot arrives, and no one sees you anymore. But riding in those cars were neither armed men nor a wanderer with a scythe. This is how love loved to visit us, and snatches wailed. Completely free only in public toilets, where for a little change nobody cared what we were doing. We fought the summer heat, the winter snow. When we discovered we ourselves were the language, and our tongues were removed, we started talking with our eyes. When our eyes were poked out, we talked with our hands. When our hands were cut off, we conversed with our toes. When we were shot in the legs, we nodded our heads for yes and shook our heads for no. And when they ate our heads alive, we crawled back into the bellies of our sleeping mothers, as if into bomb shelters, to be born again. And there on the horizon, the gymnast of our future was leaping through the fiery hoop of the sun. Now, it's obviously very intense imagery, but before we sort of jump into the text, it's important that we sort of contextualize the poem for us. Now, this is obviously coming to us in translation, and this is translated by Franz Wright and Elizabeth Oakers Wright. So, obviously, it's originally in Belarusian. Now, Mort is commenting on the language itself. She's commenting on Belarusian. So that means we need to understand why does she choose such a strong stance to do so. Now, Belarus as a country is interestingly positioned in the Eastern Europe. Now, it's a landlocked country and it shares its largest border with Russia. And it has also frequently been referred to as Russia's younger brother. That automatically tells us what kind of status it has enjoyed, at least on an emotional, cultural, and political level. Now, because of this, as well as the fact that it used to be a part of the USSR, it holds a lot of connection with Russia, right? And it gained its independence in 91 after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And as a result of it, it's a very, if you think about it, 91 is not actually that far off. It's quite a recent kind of an experience. And in 94, when the presidential elections were held, Alexander Lukashenko became its president and has remained the president since then. Now, in 95, Russia was accorded co-official language status along with Belarusian, and that really starts off the Russification of modern day Belarus, all right, in current context. Because see, Soviet experience of Belarus is different from post-Soviet, post-independence Belarus. But even post-independence Belarus, Russia still enjoys greater political, social, cultural, economic parity over Belarusian, to a point where 70.2% of the population speak Russian, with only 23% speaking Belarusian. No more than 10% of Belarusians actually use the language in their day-to-day lives. That tells us that the language is deeply marginalized within its own country. And so, seen in that context, Mort's poem Belarusian I makes a lot of sense, because then it emerges from the space of we have been linguistically marginalized, we have been sidelined, we want to sort of take charge again of our identity. And so to achieve that, she uses a lot of hard-hitting imagery, a lot of violent imagery, as well as some fascinating metaphors, all right, to sort of convey this idea, to convey basically the loss of identity, the sense of oppression, the sense that we're marginalized, the sense that we need to fight for our linguistic freedom. So this is then a very fine example of resistance poetry, right? Because ultimately it is challenging the Russification of Belarusian, right? And so Belarusian I, and the idea that we all have to come together as one to sort of rescue our language from this oppressive or secondary treatment accorded to them. And remember, as I mentioned, Belarus has always been seen as the younger brother of Russia, so it's already been mentally accorded a secondary status, and so this is a sort of reasserting themselves, sort of placing them back in a position of relevance. Now, the poem is actually split into 4 parts, so 4 stanzas, and it's all written in lowercase. Now that itself is very interesting. Also, all the lines have varying lengths. There's a free verse pattern that is being followed here. There's enjambment, so the lines are constantly running into the next. There's metaphor, there's simile. There's also repetition being used for emphasis. All right, so sort of reiterating and reiterating a certain idea. All right, and now even the fact that the poem chooses to use lowercase is very interesting, because the idea of presenting an entire text in lowercase also sort of stands for someone who doesn't enjoy power or doesn't have access to power speaking up or expressing themselves. It's literally like, I'm in the margins and I'm speaking up for what I really feel or what I'm experiencing. So it is that kind of a narrative as well, kind of like the narrative of the small, and so structurally as well, Mort's poem highlights this idea for us. Now, let's look at that stanza by stanza. So the first stanza itself, I'm just going to reread it. Even our mothers have no idea how we were born, how we parted their legs and crawled out into the world, the way you crawl from the ruins after a bombing. We couldn't tell which of us was a girl or a boy. We gorged on dirt, thinking it was bread, and our future, a gymnast on a thin thread of the horizon, was performing there at the highest pitch. Now, it uses war imagery, all right, and very evocative kind of language. Also, implied throughout this stanza is the idea that there is no clarity as far as your identity, right? Because even our mothers have no idea how we were born, how we parted their legs and crawled out into the world. So the idea that no one around them knows how they've come to be, where they come from, nothing. So their identity is entirely unclear, all right? And the fact that they have to be personally responsible for their identity. That means you cannot depend on the generation before you to do this, to fight for you, because they have been warped by their experiences of war and violence and all of those things. So they are not in a position to be able to make an informed decision. So that onus is entirely on you. That responsibility falls entirely on you. Also, the entire thing is an image of chaos, of fragmentation, because the line also goes, the way you crawl from the ruins after a bombing. So it's all broken, destroyed, crushed, and you literally have to fight for your survival. Recall that the overarching theme of the entire poem is the idea that you're fighting for the survival of your language. Your language is your central identity. Our language ties up with our cultural, social, emotional, psychological identity itself, because we have words that are unique to our cultural experience. We have words that are unique to our emotional experience. So language is not merely only communication, it also implies a lot of other things. So she is then highlighting all of those things. All of that comes together in this, because if that primary identity of yours is completely sidelined, then how do you reassert yourself? How do you reposition yourself as relevant in this entire scenario? So they have to make their own decisions. Also, again, another statement about that lack of clarity of identity is the line, we couldn't tell which of us was a girl or a boy. So literally, your identity is unclear. You can't say anything about who you are. You can't even claim that very first thing, because it's assumed that at least that is obvious, but that's also not obvious anymore. Then goes on dirt thinking to his bread. It's a symbol of deprivation, the fact that the very basic thing that's supposed to sustain you is not there, and so in your abject, hunger, you will eat anything that looks like it could at least fill your stomach. It may not offer sustenance, but it will fill your stomach. It's kind of like, if I must communicate and there's no other option, then maybe I'll have to communicate in this, but it doesn't sustain me. It doesn't do anything for me. It doesn't fulfill me. So, very strong statements. Then, and our future, a gymnast on a thin thread of the horizon was performing there at the highest pitch. Now, thin thread of the horizon, it's all images that sort of highlight this sense of precariousness, the sense that there's no balance, there's no clarity, or you're struggling to sort of hold yourself in that position. Because again, it is about that. It's about a struggle. It's about a struggle to hold on to your identity. It's a struggle to not fall down, right? To keep your balance, to keep centered. Because in any kind of resistance, it is ultimately going to be a hard experience for the person. And so how do you sort of maintain your equilibrium in such a situation is what's being highlighted for us. And then the very expressive bitch, because at the end of it's like your frustration is like, ugh, I'm so bitch. It's really coming from this very personal kind of a space. So it's a really interesting statement right there. Now, in this particular segment is also the word performing. Language actually qualifies as a performance in many ways. So the idea that language exists in performance, in how we perform our culture, perform our experiences, perform our identity, because that's how our language continues to sort of be relevant in our day-to-day scenario. So performance itself is another interesting thing that comes here. Now, let's look at the second stanza. So, we grew up in a country where first your door is stroked with chalk, then at dark a chariot arrives, and no one sees you anymore. But riding in those cars were neither armed men nor a wanderer with a scythe. This is how love loved to visit us and snatch us veiled. Dark. Now, maybe a little context, again, to the imagery that she's using over here. So it seems to echo the image of the biblical incident of when the Hebrew people marked their lintels and their doors with blood to sort of ward off the angel of death, while the angel went and wreaked havoc across Egypt. So that was seen as a very significant incident in the Bible, and it was this incident that you're being protected against adversity. And many Europeans, it started in medieval Europe, they would mark their doors with chalk. They would get chalk blessed, and then they would mark their doors to again sort of reenact this entire incident. And so the idea that once they mark their doors, they are protected from the evil one, because it's no more angel of death wreaking havoc or sort of bringing justice to the Hebrew people as it is in the biblical narrative, but it's about just general evil, keeping it away from you. So that is the framework. So it's entirely possible that this is a practice that continues even in Eastern Europe in many places, and hence the marking with chalk. Now the thing is, that act of marking your doors with chalk is a mark of protection. It implies that once you've marked your door with the chalk, nothing is going to come and affect you. And in fact, in East European belief, the idea was that if you did not mark your door with chalk, the dragon, the symbol of the evil one, would wander around, come to the house that has no, chalk mark, and snatch up whoever they like, whoever they love, and then just take them, basically rob them of their life and their health and everything else. So that is the image. Yet the stanza does not imply anything positive. It's more like an ironic subversion of this imagery. The idea is that there is no protection because, first your door is struck with chalk and then a chariot arrives. So the idea is that if your door is struck with chalk, nothing is going to come and take you. But here's the reverse. It's like your door is marked and then you're taken away. It actually also ties up with the kind of Soviet-era surveillance that was very common in USSR, where neighbors would keep tabs on neighbors. People would tell on you. They would, talk about whatever you were up to. And if the authorities felt that you were questionable, you were taken away at the dead of night, And that itself would be so frightening for everyone living around there because they're like, oh, that person disappeared. We don't know how, when, where. And so everyone automatically is sort of seized with fear and then cannot do anything, cannot resist. So it seems to also highlight that because it's the idea that, you are being taken away, not being protected. And also the last line is like an absolute sarcastic, subversion of this entire thing because it's how love loved to visit us and snatch us wailed. The idea of the dragon that takes you away because it loves you and so it wants you for themselves. It's kind of the same thing. So it's love, it's not consensual, it's not out of choice, it's love, and that love wishes to take you away. Whether you want to accompany that person or not is a whole different equation. So it's a really dark retelling of the original story that stood for protection. But here it's like, you resist, you speak up, you voice your concerns, and somebody takes you up. So again, that fear, it just builds into you. Should I be doing this? Is this a good idea? Should I maybe lay low? It's this genuine fear that you're constantly being watched and you don't know how you're going to sort of escape from this. All right, so let's pause over here and we'll continue in the next.